Welcome, everyone. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Eric Jorgensen. I am the founder of Special Needs Navigator. I started Special Needs Navigator to help families, individuals, and caregivers navigate the maze of benefits, resources, and services. Today, I have with me licensed therapist Lauren Presutti. She understands life is hard, problems can be complicated, and every person has struggled at one point or another. Life can be difficult for many people, and acutely so for those who have been exposed to particularly challenging experiences, like those who have disabilities and their families. Lauren was born with muscular dystrophy and has used a wheelchair her whole life. She has adapted her body and circumstances in such profound ways that flexible thinking, coping, and resourcefulness have become second nature to her. And I can echo this. After talking to her, I definitely see this. This has taught her that authentically confronting her experiences of suffering and pain allows her to grow stronger in areas of resiliency and empowerment. As a therapist, she uses these skills to help others examine their stories and find their place in the world. She supports dialogue surrounding acceptance and empowerment, and at her core, she appreciates the differences of managing emotional pain and seeks to honor you wherever you may be in your journey. And the reason I have her here today is because I wanted somebody who could express the values of therapy to wherever you are in your journey. And being completely transparent, as a retired Navy submariner, I was never a big fan of therapy. I used to poo-poo it, and I've come to appreciate it more. So after we give Lauren an opportunity to share some more about her personal story, we're going to talk about how men can benefit from therapy, how parents can benefit from therapy, and finally, how people with disabilities can benefit from therapy. And this is um, some of this may be a no-brainer for you, but the audience that I really want to speak to are men, and well, everybody on here, but really men. I want you to really listen because I think we're the ones guiltiest of perhaps going in something half-heartedly is probably the nicest way to say it. So, with that introduction, please join me in welcoming Lauren. Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eric. It's really a pleasure to do this interview with you. Like you mentioned, I was born with muscular dystrophy. I started using my first wheelchair when I was about 5 years old. And growing up, I have always noticed the unique narratives and the unique experiences about individuals affected by disabilities of all types. I've noticed things like ableism. I've noticed the way that we perceive disability. I've noticed the barriers that exist for families with disabilities. And I couldn't help but want to do something in my career that would serve this community in some way. And for me, my specialization has always been in the mental health field. Growing up, I've always noticed that I want individuals with disabilities and their families to feel empowered. I want them to work through feelings of shame. I want them to be able to feel confident in themselves accessing resources. But at the end of the day, I always thought, how can they possibly live a life of empowerment if they're struggling with things like anxiety or depression or shame, or if they're worried about the way that they're perceived, or if they're struggling with their identity? Those are all things that are related to someone's mental health. And I thought to myself, we really don't have enough mental health clinicians that really know anything about disability. When we look at graduate programs and training programs for therapists, even in my own experience going through graduate school and my own clinical training, nobody really talked about disability. Nobody really talked about, the unique perspectives and the unique realities for individuals affected by disabilities, as well as parents and men in particular, like you mentioned. So, my practice really focuses on that intersection. How can I use my clinical training as a mental health therapist and combine that with my personal life experiences and the firsthand knowledge that I have on disability to create that space to fill that gap in the community, if that makes sense.
That's incredible, and I think there's a lot to be said to having personal experience. I think it's As we were talking before I started recording, I'm a white male. There's a lot of things I haven't experienced because of my privilege, right? So it's very difficult for me to put myself in somebody else's shoes, even though I could try to be empathetic and imagine.
Sure.
It's not the same thing.
Right. And so I do think that one of my biggest strengths is being able to relate to individuals with disabilities. And, a lot of my clients say, they've had other therapists or they've had other types of clinicians, but it's been really difficult for them to feel authentically understood and that deep connection, that intimate, natural sense of connection. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. But I also provide a disclaimer at the beginning of therapy and say, we both may use wheelchairs, we both may have disabilities, but I also really want to acknowledge and honor that everybody's experience is unique. And so, even though I think there is a lot to be said about the natural ability to relate, I think it's also important to recognize that people with disabilities of all different types do have different backgrounds and different experiences. And we need to create space for all of those experiences to be honored.
I love that, and that was part of what drew me to reaching out to you is that phrase, acknowledge and honor, because it's more than just saying I hear you, right? It's
Mhm.
actually internalizing it and saying, well, who are you? Who am I hearing?
Sure.
Um,
A lot of individuals with disabilities, I think, and parents and families, they grow up in this community where sometimes, not always, but sometimes they feel isolated and they feel like they're not receiving a lot of true empathy. And if they do receive, condolences from other people in their community, it comes across as pity or it comes across as that, oh, I'm so sorry for you. Or, people without disabilities, the non disabled population, it can be hard for them to really empathize with those with disabilities because, it's hard to understand. It's hard to, relate to that. It's hard to know what questions to ask and what questions not to ask. So, as a consequence, a lot of people with disabilities feel like they haven't received a lot of that genuine emotional attunement, that emotional empathy. And I think therapy creates that space where I can work with people to let them know that their feelings do matter and I can provide that emotional attunement so that they can work through the things that they need to work through in a safe way without feeling pitied or without feeling like I or anyone else is feeling sorry for them.
that's powerful. That's important. And um, when you said feel isolated, I can tell you I think a lot of men feel the same way, right? Like
Of course,
they're
absolutely.
they're the provider, right? They can't be weak. They feel they may feel. I don't want to say they all feel. They may feel they can't show weakness before their spouse, right?
Mhm. Of
Uh,
course, we have these ideas of masculinity. I think it's really important to talk about men and the environment of therapy because, even though it's 2020 and we've come a long way, there still exists this misconception and this stereotype that says, oh, men don't talk about their feelings, and if they do talk about their feelings, it's looked down upon, or in some way, it's perceived as they're not strong, or they're not like the strong men that can provide. They're weak in some way, and I think that's completely a misconception. And I would argue the opposite that a person, a man, woman, whatever gender, gender fluidity is a thing. So no matter what gender you are, I think if you are able to confront your emotions, if you're able to say, I really need to work through some things to live my best life, and I think I'm going to talk to a professional about that, and I'm going to take care of myself, I think that's an enormous amount of strength. So when we talk about men, especially in masculinity, those that identify as being a man, I mean, what is that saying about this masculinity? It says our community says that if you're a man, you shouldn't have feelings, but I really think it's the opposite. If you're able to show that you are emotionally intelligent, I think that's a huge sign of strength. And that does elicit, a lot of strength and wisdom and intelligence and ability to empathize, resiliency, problem solving skills. A lot of times men, like you mentioned, will feel like they have to be the provider. They have to figure things out. They have to, be the provider for the family. They have to be strong all the time. But what happens when they're struggling and they're not going to be able to provide? How are you going to care for your family? How are you going to give to other people? How are you going to show up in the world as a problem solver if you're struggling internally? So, therapy allows that space where you can come in, shut out the rest of the world, and just say, listen, I just need an hour to work through some things so that I can live my best life in the rest of my world, so I can work through this on a weekly basis or whatever the setup might be, so that I can take care of myself, so that I can take care of those in my family. I think that's just an enormous amount of strength and wisdom to do that.
I love that, Lauren, and I wrote down and underlined "live my best life" because you've said that quite a few times.
Mhm.
It just resonates. I mean, it's so. I think people need to internalize that. Are you living your best life? If you're not, and I would argue most of us probably are not, how can we get there?
Of course, life is hard, life is short, life is complicated and messy. And I do say that a lot, that I want people to live their best life. And another thing that I like to say is that life is hard enough. Don't do it alone. I mean, we're all struggling, whether we have a disability or we're caring for someone with a disability. We're dealing with some pretty complex things. We have some complicated problems. We're trying to navigate them the best that we can. We're all struggling with something in one way or another. If you're struggling more than you have to, why would you possibly settle for that? Why would you do that to yourself? Why would you make things harder on yourself than they have to be? There's no shame in going to therapy. And if you feel like there is shame, I would really encourage you to think about where that comes from. Who taught you that? Who taught you that going to therapy and working on your mental health is something to be ashamed about? Is it the media? Is it relatives? Is it what's put out there in the world? Is it, just different ways that we talk about mental health? Is it historical things that happened in the past with mental health? Where does that come from? Because if we can identify where our beliefs come from, in this example, feeling ashamed about therapy, if we can identify why we feel that way, we're going to be more likely and more capable of challenging that and fighting against that thought and saying, I'm having this thought that it might be something to feel weak about, but in reality, it's not. And in reality, I'm doing what's best for me. I'm making my life easier and I'm making myself more capable of showing up in the world in the way that I can live best.
Wow. And again, speaking from personal experience, asking yourself where's the feeling of shame coming from,
Mhm,
it's not something that came readily to me. I would kind of throw out when I did that for myself.
mhm,
um I would throw out some kind of nonsense answers, right? Just something like, yeah, whatever.
mhm.
um it took a lot of work. I mean, it's a simple question, but it's not easy to answer.
It's definitely not easy. What helped you, Eric? I'm just curious. What helped you kind of work through some of those fears?
So after my wife died, I had a lot of anger and some other things. So rather than work with a professional, which would have been much more constructive, I went for a lot of very long hikes in the woods, and I would yell, I would talk out loud,
Hmm.
a lot of talking out loud, because hearing myself say stuff, I
Release
was
it.
able to figure out, okay, wait a minute, time out, that's ridiculous.
Sure. Oh, that's so helpful getting in nature. And, that sounds really healthy in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have been faster if I'd worked with somebody,
Sure.
you know?
Probably. But you got there eventually. You worked
Yeah,
through it.
yeah, yeah,
That's great.
and um, I've been working with a coach, not for mental health issues, but
Mhm.
just for business stuff, because it's the same thing that you've said. Life is hard. Don't do it alone, right?
Mhm.
In my case, being a business owner is hard enough.
Of
So
course.
hire somebody, work with somebody to work that stuff out, and
It's the
um,
same concept, when we need help with something, when we need some professional advice, whether it's, a doctor, a business coach, a car mechanic, whatever the case is, it's okay to reach out for that help. It's okay to admit to ourselves that we don't know everything. We're not an expert on a medical condition, a business strategy. We're not an expert on fixing our car. We're going to reach out for help. It's the same metaphor, it's the same thing. If we're feeling like we're really struggling with some anger, depression, anxiety, shame, I mean, how can we expect ourselves to be an expert on that kind of stuff? I mean, how can we expect ourselves to have the training that is provided for therapists when they go through rigorous clinical graduate programs and training? I mean, we can't expect ourselves to fix and solve everything by ourselves, and we shouldn't have to. It's okay
and
to reach out.
and that is a huge, perfect segue because parents
Mm,
don't feel like they can, they have to have all the answers. Again, speaking as a parent,
mhm,
you feel like you have to have all the answers. So to your point, Lauren, about why aren't people, if you're not mechanically inclined and you have your car's making weird noises, are you
mhm.
really going to try to look and figure it out on your own in the garage? No, probably not. If you're not mechanically inclined. Uh,
Exactly. I mean, that would just be a big frustration. Imagine how frustrated you would be, and imagine just how counterproductive that might be. It doesn't make sense. So it's the same
and
thing.
and
You're right. Of
so the same would apply for parents, right? If parents are like,
course.
I just don't understand how to communicate with my child or why, or with my spouse or with whatever. I just,
Mhm.
I'm struggling with communication or,
Of course.
um, I'm a,
Parents,
or
definitely.
maybe they haven't voiced this, but like I was sharing with you before we started recording, personally, and perhaps other parents feel this way too, a fear that your child's never going to be, not as
Mhm.
capable or, something like that.
Absolutely. So, parents of individuals with disabilities go through a lot of things. And one of those difficulties is the feeling of having to have it all figured out. The feeling of, I have to have all the answers. I have to be the role model for my child. I have to protect my child. And that's the same for all parents, but especially those with disabilities. Parents have this overwhelming feeling that you have to be strong for your child all the time. You have to protect your child. You have to give your child every opportunity to succeed and to thrive. And that's an enormous amount of pressure. I mean, just speaking about the things that parents put on themselves to make their children feel like they can do anything in the world, it's a huge amount of pressure. And I think that's okay, but we also need to find ways to cope with that pressure and to find ways that we can find a healthy balance between feeling like we have to do everything right for our children and also letting our children have a voice and letting our children have some autonomy and some freedom to grow on their own. Does that make sense?
It does. I think there some of the people watching may be asking, well, how do we find that healthy balance? We're fighting the school district where we've got with the IEP. We're getting told we have to prep for transition because our child's gonna be aging out of school, and it's scary. I mean, so how do we find a balance?
It is really difficult, and there's not really one magic answer, but I think it's really important to be present in the moment and practice mindfulness and to really slow down a little bit because, like I said, when we feel all that pressure, it's almost like we're in rapid fight or flight mode. We're always going, we're always trying to fix the next thing and fight this and fight that. And sometimes that can take away the natural relationship with your child, the natural small moments where you see them succeed in something that exceeded your expectations, or you see them voice their opinion about something and speak up, or when you give them a little bit more freedom, maybe loosen your control just a little bit and allow them to try something on their own on the playground or in school and giving them that freedom to feel like they're their own person and that they're not limited by the stereotypes or the medical diagnosis or what the barriers might be in the school system. So practice mindfulness. That really means paying attention to what's happening today and not worrying so obsessively about the future every moment of the day. Really giving yourself and your children that space to reflect on what they're going through, to talk about emotions openly, and give them space to say if they're feeling like they're getting a little overwhelmed with things. Maybe they need a break. Maybe you need a day off. Maybe you don't fight for something all day and talk about it so much that you're really missing out on their personality aside from the disability. Does that make sense?
I it does, Lauren, and I love it. I would add to it, in maybe not from a therapy point of view, but when you said give the children more freedom, it brought to mind the successes my sons had. And if you don't mind, I'm going to share real
Sure, of
quickly.
course.
So, my son over the last 8 years has grown into quite the young man. And 2 years ago, I think it was, he advocated that he no longer wanted to take a yellow school bus because that's for kids. He
Hmm.
wanted to take public transportation. You want to talk about scary?
Yeah, oh my goodness. But also how incredible that he was able to self-advocate and to be self-aware. I mean, that's emotional intelligence. That's everything. I mean, that's the skills that we want people to have to be able to make those decisions and to say, "Wait a minute, just because this is the way that I've always done things doesn't mean that this is the way that I want to do things. Maybe I can do something different. Maybe I can feel more empowered and maybe I can take more control in my life and speak up about something like that."
Exactly, and he did, and now well, pre-COVID, he would just go ride the bus just to ride the bus. I mean,
Sure.
it's so crazy to me that he's able to. First of all, I'm really glad he does it, right? Um,
Absolutely. It gives you that, maybe that was feeling really scary in the beginning and feeling like, oh my goodness, this is such a big change. What if something happens? What if other people aren't always understanding? But think about the growth that that gave him, but also the growth that it gave you. I mean, tolerating that discomfort that you went through gave you that ability to trust it, to trust in him, and to trust that it was going to be something that you both were going to work through, and that was ultimately going to help him live a life that mattered to him and making the decisions that were important to him.
right, and it all stemmed from his ability to self-advocate, which is right here. It's really this could be an opportunity for individuals who have disabilities themselves. Maybe they don't feel like they have a voice,
Of
right?
course. Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think about the common experiences for people with disabilities, especially from childhood. We grow up feeling like other people are always speaking for us, whether they're doctors, physical therapists, occupational therapists, teachers, employers, when we start to get older and start to do things in college. Like, we're always looking at what other people of authority are saying about our lives. I experienced this in elementary school and also when I was in college and beyond. I mean, there's always going to be other adults and other people that feel like they know what's best for you. But the reality is that you are your own best advocate. You know your life and your abilities and your circumstances better than anyone. And I think that's hard for people sometimes to trust their instincts because these are professionals. They're physical therapists or occupational therapists and, teachers and advocates in the community. And they think that maybe they know what's best for me. Maybe I should just listen to them. And they internalize that and that fear of countering what they might say and speaking up leads them to believe that they can't speak up. Like they don't have a voice. Like, I'm just so used to other people making decisions for me that, it's just hard for me to speak up on my own. And that's why I think that as early as, elementary school, include your child in the IEP. Ask them what they feel about certain things. Ask them how they believe these accommodations are going to be helpful to them. Ask them, their opinion. And I know for children especially, you have to find a balance because sometimes children just don't have those skills to fight a system. And so of course the parents are going to be fighting that system alongside them. But nonetheless, there should be at least some room for you to give your child a voice. And as they grow up through middle school and high school, increase those opportunities more and more. Give them a voice more and more so that they can grow up as an autonomous individual who feels like I can speak up. I know how to do that. I know how to advocate for myself. I mean, the truth is that individuals with disabilities are going to have to advocate for the rest of their lives no matter what their age is or where they are in their life circumstances. There's always going to be barriers. There's always going to be different transitions. There's always going to be whether you're moving to a new city or starting a new job or going to a new community program or just making a change in your weekly routine. There's always going to be opportunities for you to have to advocate for yourself. Unfortunately, it's just because the world doesn't always understand disability. We don't have a perfect system where disability is always accepted and validated. We all face that feeling of being misunderstood from time to time. I think that makes it all the more necessary to learn how to speak up.
Wow. Um, I'm not really sure how to follow that up because I mean that's powerful. I would the only thing I think I would add is don't just ask, but actually listen. I think a lot of
Listen.
parents might say, "Well, do you want the blue shirt or the red shirt?" Well, you
Mhm,
don't really want the blue shirt. You want the red shirt, right?
mhm. Exactly.
No, if they say they want a shirt, let
Let them
listen.
choose. Exactly. I mean, give your children as many opportunities to make choices. Give them that power. Give them that choice and listen to them. Validate their experiences. And sometimes that means listening actively instead of just coming up with the next thing to say. Slowing down, make eye contact, stop multitasking when you have these conversations. Really sit down with someone and ask them how they're doing in school, how they're doing with their friends, what's going on in their life. I want to hear from you. I want to listen. I want to empathize and show curiosity. Don't just ask to ask with, the half-hearted approach. Really show that you're curious. Show that you're interested. Think about how other people make you feel like they're listening to you, and then replicate those same behaviors to your children, no matter what their age are, whether they're grown adults or young children. Really show that you're curious. I think that can really go a long way.
Wow, that's yeah. And if you're the individual with the disability and you're not feeling heard, don't be afraid to speak up, right? I mean, um,
Definitely. I mean, and this goes back to therapy. I mean, if you feel like you don't really have that many opportunities to feel heard and like, you're struggling in some way and you may be experiencing a little bit of shame or doubt, you may be doubting your self advocacy skills and maybe you do want to talk to a professional about that and talk about, how can I work on this? How can I work on this so that I can get better at this, so that I can feel more in control of my life, so that I feel like I can face challenges and opportunities head on without worrying about my advocacy skills. So talk with your local community about what resources might be available to talk with either advocates or therapists, and ask them, do they have experience with people with disabilities? Do they understand disability? Ask them those questions because if you have a goal to work on certain aspects of self advocacy, it's okay to reach out and to try something like therapy. Like we said before, you don't have to do it alone.
awesome. And are therapists pretty transparent about whether or not they have experience with disabilities, generally speaking? I mean, I know you can't speak for every therapist, Lauren.
Sure. I really can't speak for every therapist, but for the ones that I know, they have tended to be more really transparent. So I would say, ask for a free consultation. Ask them if they have experience with disability. They do tend to be transparent. They should be transparent. Same for me, if someone asks me about substance abuse, I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert in that because that's not my area. So I am going to be transparent and say, I really don't work a lot with substance abuse, but I know someone who can help. So I think if you confront a therapist, if you call a therapist and say, do you have experience with disability? I really want to know honestly. If they say that they don't, ask them if they know anybody who does. And usually therapists are well connected among each other in a community. So if they're not experienced in disability, they may know someone else who does, or at least someone experienced with chronic health conditions or chronic illnesses, which again doesn't exactly equate to disability, but they may be more skilled in advocacy, at least in that way.
That's great points. Thank you. And so you are physically located in Michigan. Um,
Yes.
and
I
that's where you do all of your therapy work, right? Is anybody who lives in Michigan can work with you for therapy, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, psychotherapy, in which diagnosing happens, formal assessment, treatment of mental illness, that is available in Michigan throughout the entire state through online telehealth. And then I also offer mental health coaching for anybody globally. So, coaching has some limitations. I will be very transparent about that. I'm not able to diagnose, I'm not able to work with your psychiatrist, I'm not able to provide formal treatment for mental illness because, again, I only am licensed to provide psychotherapy at this time in Michigan. However, if you're looking for that intimate relationship that is similar to psychotherapy and has similar um, goals for learning new things about yourself, discovering your values and beliefs, working on self advocacy, slowing down, practicing mindfulness, doing all of those things that are really similar to therapy but just don't include diagnosis or medication assistance or things like that. Mental health coaching can be a great option for you, and that's available for anybody globally.
Awesome. And for those of you that aren't familiar with mindfulness, what is there a like an easier way to explain mindfulness, or is it pretty self-explanatory? Am I just overthinking it?
Sure. Yeah, so mindfulness has a lot of different definitions, but I like to think of it as the practice of slowing down, noticing your thoughts and beliefs, being mindfully present. So instead of having a lot of racing thoughts and anxiety, a mindfulness exercise would be something that you do with a therapist or on your own, where you practice deep breathing or you do something slowly, like drawing, or you listen to music and you really slow down, and it's a lot of introspection. So it's a lot of just being mindful, being very present. It's about noticing your behaviors. It's a lot of introspection. So we use the term mindfulness when we talk about like mindful eating, for example, for eating disorders, being really mindful about your eating behaviors, slowing down and making right decisions instead of making unhealthy decisions. Or mindful exercising, being mindful about how you're using your body and practicing mindfulness where you're slowing down and creating some really healthy goals that are very much related to how you reflect on yourself. Mindful journaling, journaling in ways that facilitate growth and self reflection and self awareness. So, there's a lot of different ways that mindfulness can be incorporated into activities. A lot of the themes are similar to yoga. So, doing like things that are good for your soul, your mind, your body. You can just Google mindfulness exercises, and there's so many YouTube channels and exercises online that will do like a guided meditation or a guided breathing technique that can help you slow down. It's really useful when someone's having a panic attack or feeling really overwhelmed in the moment.
Oh, that's awesome, Lauren. Thank you again for the gift of your time and your knowledge.
Absolutely. It's such a great thing to connect with people like you, Eric. And I'm just so grateful for being interviewed with you. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, I'm sure we'll be having you back to talk more about the mental health coaching and maybe a deeper dive into the therapy itself. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.